Welcome! Here's your bubbly and beautiful host, Elizabeth. It's the Caffeinated Cooper Show! Yeah, I believe in you. I don't believe in lucky seconds. I'm not sure about Loch Ness, but I know I believe in angels. I believe in happiness. Good afternoon, everybody. It is wonderful to see you. I am so very, very happy that I have a really special gentleman connected with us this afternoon, and he is going to be talking about a new topic, something I've never even explored on the show thus far. So I'm really excited. We're going to get to him in just a minute. First up, I want to give a shout out to a very special sponsor. Let's see. Let's do a little sponsor dive. I'm going to put my hand in the bag. Let's see what we have. We have Viter Energy. Viter Energy mints are absolutely fantastic. I do enjoy my caffeine since it's a Caffeinated Cooper Show. However, let me give you a little bit of a backstory on that while I bring up the picture of Viter Energy and all the flavors of Viter Energy mints. So it is called the Caffeinated Cooper Show, right? Am I a caffeineaholic? No, I'm not. I enjoy my caffeine, but that's actually because in the very beginning, every single time that we would hit, action and the camera is rolling, I just always came out so energetic. So everybody's like, "Oh my gosh, you're like the Energizer Bunny. You're just go 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 go." So Caffeinated Cooper Show. It's actually about me, but all my sponsors are a caffeinated product because why not? It fits, right? Brand marketing. And here it is, Viter Energy. So I want to bring up their information so that you can write it down and go to their website at your leisure. But of course, not right now because we are about to get into a wonderful conversation. Their website is goviter.com. That's GOVITER.com. And let's talk about the flavors that they have. Now, they really captured my heart with having the flavor of wintergreen. I love wintergreen. I remember being a little girl and walking downtown. We lived just in New Jersey, outside of New York City. So, if you can picture it, it's a Jersey suburb. So, row houses, and you walk down to your main street, and that's where all your shops are and things like that. And I was walking with my father in the wintertime, and I was actually walking to CCD class. If anybody's Catholic out there, you know what that is. And he had a wintergreen mint in his pocket and gave one to me. And I loved it. Oh my gosh. So I have been so hooked. It always makes me think of my daddy. But wintergreen, spearmint, peppermint, cinnamon, and chocolate mint. And their wintergreen is really very pleasant. It's a nice one. So it'll give you 40 milligrams of caffeine per tin. So per mint, not tin. Per mint. And the mints, I'll show you, they're about double size of a Tic Tac or something like that. They're not very big. And, there's a vitamin right there. So that's half a cup of caffeine and a half a cup of coffee. It has vitamin B complex in each mint, niacin B3, vitamin B6, folic acid, which is B9, and B12. And there are 20 mints per tin, sugar-free, 0 calories, and a strong minty flavor. So they're also vegan, Star-K kosher, gluten, dairy, soy, wheat free, and you can purchase them on Amazon, also at Walmart and goviter.com. So please go check it out. It's a wonderful company. I am really, really proud of all of our sponsors and all the products that we talk about in the beginning of every show. And if you're interested in becoming a sponsor on the show, please email us at ecooperstudios@gmail.com. We are actually looking for a few new ones, and I think we've secured a new one. So I'm going to have the first sponsor interview coming up in the next few weeks. I'm really excited. I love talking to these guys. I love talking about business and how they started and how they brought their product to market. I mean, that's just something fairly foreign to me when it comes to products such as that. So anyway, let's talk about the gentleman that we have connected. His name is Bob Vetter. And Bob is a cultural anthropologist whose life work concerns the intersection of spirituality and healing in diverse indigenous cultures. His original fieldwork focused on Native American medicine, especially that of the South Plains. And the South Plains, as we all know, is Texas, Oklahoma, South Kansas, and East New Mexico. Along with his adopted uncle, medicine man Richard Tarish Sr., he authored the book Big Bow, The Spiritual Life and Teachings of a Kiowa Family. He has studied the traditional Mesoamerican healing system called, okay, I'm going to make sure I get this right, Curanderismo. He's going to correct me. I'm sure of it. With teachers both in the United States and in Mexico, and maintains a healing practice as well as a community, Temazcal, which is a traditional Mesoamerican sweat lodge or house of vapor in New York. Robert is a featured curandero in the book Curanderismo, Traditional Heroes of Mexico and the Southwest of Eliseo Torres. And I didn't phonetically check this one. Emmanuel Miranda and Emmanuel Miranda. So those are the two people that he worked with. He is an instructor at the University of New Mexico's annual conference on Curanderismo, as well as Coursera's online course entitled Curanderismo. My goodness, Bob. Traditional medicine of Mexico and Southwest. You can tell I'm an East Coast girl, can't you? Because I am stumbling all the way down this. He hosts a podcast entitled Healing and Spirituality in World Cultures on iTunes and all major podcast platforms. Without any further ado, Mr. Bob Vetter, how are you?
Oh, it's so wonderful to be with you, Elizabeth. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. Give me an education on those words that I stumbled on. Did I say any of them right?
You were close. So the word that we focus on here is Curanderismo, and it comes from the Spanish word curar, meaning to cure or to heal. So I'll be talking about the indigenous healing arts of Mexico.
Oh my goodness. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. And I needed to study that a little bit more because you say that so eloquently. I love it. All right. Now, from my research, and I want to know where this all began, but I'm kind of curious. So what part of the world are you in right now?
I'm in New York.
You're in New York. Are you from New York?
I am from New York.
Okay. What brought you to the Southern Plains?
Yeah, so that's a curious story. So I grew up here. I'm on Long Island right now. I grew up on Long Island, and as a child already, I was really fascinated by the topic of spirituality. And, from early on, I was not satisfied with the answers that I got to understanding my place in the universe through the religion that I grew up in, which was Presbyterian Christianity. And at the age of about 12 years old, when my friends were all into the things they were into, I was reading books on Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Asian philosophies, because I felt that they gave me better answers. So it was really my belief that there was something inherently wrong in my own culture that led me to want to look at other cultures, look at what is possible, what is prescribed on how to live in other cultures. As an undergraduate, I went to college upstate New York at SUNY Oneonta, where I studied philosophy and anthropology. While I was there, I went to India and was absolutely taken by yoga, by Hinduism, by meditation. And, this is way before it kind of got to be the fashionable trend that it is in the world today. But it was when I went on to graduate school that things really changed for me in my trajectory. And The reason is I thought that I was going to get into a program at the University of Hawaii that my mentor, Dr. Ashok Malhotra, had taken. He left India, went to Hawaii, and did this program. And I really kind of thought that when I applied for it that I would get in with this full grant, but I was rejected and I was going to take a year off. And he called me at the last minute and told me that a colleague of his at the University of Oklahoma was looking for a promising graduate student in philosophy. So I applied, got the assistantship, moved to Oklahoma, got there, enrolled in philosophy classes, and hated it. So I was about to leave. I was going to just, throw everything in my car and drive all the way back to New York. But at the last minute, I decided that I would walk into the anthropology department, since that was actually my major, and just kind of check it out, feel out what it was like. And I walked in and I met with the director of the program, and he told me that if I would agree to teach anthropology and teach the introductory course to anthropology, that they would honor the same assistantship that I had in the philosophy department. So I accepted it, which included, of course, this challenge to literally go from being an undergrad the last semester to now teaching undergrads. But I agreed to take that on. And there was a catch-22, though, because by then it was too late in the semester for me to enroll in anthropology classes, but I needed a full-time course load in order to maintain my assistantship. So they agreed to let me do something called ethnography. I was going to do a residency in ethnography. Now, ethnography is the branch of cultural anthropology where you go in and you learn about a particular culture firsthand by doing something called participant observation, meaning that you immerse yourself in the life of the people there, while at the same time, you kind of step back and look at it from afar. My area of interest, as I said, was, or as you said in my bio, was the intersection of healing and spirituality. And while those two go together very neatly today, at the time, this was not a common thing to connect those two. So I figured, since I found myself in Oklahoma, which is the heart of Indian country, for those listeners who don't know, there are more different tribes of Native Americans living in the state of Oklahoma than in any other state in the United States. So I decided that I would do my field work attempting to find a medicine man, find out what they do, what this healing process is all about in this uniquely indigenous point of view. So I set out to meet a medicine man, and I didn't know exactly how that was going to go. I'll take you through that in just a moment, because that anecdote is going to have everything to do with everything that unfolds after that part of the story. But I'll pause for a moment, Elizabeth, in case you or anybody else has a question or comment up to here.
Okay, my question is, boy, oh boy, Long Island boy goes to college, and now you're meeting with a medicine man in Oklahoma. Whoa.
Yeah, it was a very strange thing.
Oh my goodness. Yes, I have a fellow viewer. So Warren Lee, and I'm going to call him a fellow viewer because I now feel like I'm in the viewership seat. The story you're taking us through is just absolutely mesmerizing. So I cannot wait until we get to the next piece. But he's saying, "Whoa, this is cool," and that's Warren Lee. He's in San Francisco. Thank you for watching, Warren. So okay, you're meeting a medicine man for the first time.
Well, I'm going to back up before that part of the story and tell you what led me to meet him.
Okay, yes.
So I met with my advisor, who was an older man who had spent his entire life doing field work among some of the tribes in Oklahoma. And what I thought would happen in my first meeting with him was I expected him to hear my research topic and have him tell me where I would go and basically hook me up to start the field work. But what he said had nothing to do with that at all. What he told me was, you'll have to go in with a networking approach. And I said, well, what does that mean? And he said, well, you're just going to have to go out and meet people. And maybe one person can send you to another person who can send you to another person. And eventually you might meet a medicine man. So I left from that meeting really disappointed. I went back to the apartment that I had followed the share board in the housing office and had rented an apartment with a guy named Jim. So I went back and I was kind of bummed out about it. I told Jim about what had happened, and he said, well, maybe I can help you. And I said, well, I don't really know how you're going to help me. And he said, well, I'm part Comanche. Maybe we can, I know some of my Comanche relatives. Maybe they can lead you to a medicine man. I said, oh, great. I didn't even know that he was part Comanche. So about a week later, his family was going to have a picnic in a park in the southwestern part of the state. So Jim and I got in the car and we drove all the way there. And when we got there, we got to what I would eventually find to be a relatively common thing, that the women were all together in one spot and the men were all together in a different spot. So the men, who were mostly elders at that time, were sitting in a circle of folding chairs under a big shade tree because it was hot, middle of August, Oklahoma, or September rather. So at any rate, I was introduced, and being fairly direct, which, as you know, is a New York characteristic,
Yes.
I said, hi. I greeted these older Native men. I said, hi, my name is Bob Vetter, and I'm a graduate student in anthropology, and I'm hoping to meet a medicine man. Well, I didn't realize that I had made my first of countless faux pas. And all of a sudden, it was like you could hear nothing but crickets. Everybody sat there staring at me, not saying a word. And gratefully, a moment later, one of the women came and said that the meal was ready and we should go sit down to eat. So we sat down, we ate the meal, and after the meal was over, an old man approached me at the end, and he kind of whispered to me so that nobody else could hear it. He said, I heard what you said about wanting to meet a medicine man. And from what I know, we still have one medicine man left alive in our tribe today. I don't know his name. I don't know where he lives, but I know another old man who might be able to help you. His name is Woodgie Watchataker. He doesn't have a phone, but I can tell you where he lives and maybe you can find him. So he described where this old man lived. He drew me a map on a napkin and handed that to me, and that was my guide to get there. This was many, many years before cell phones. So the next week, Jim and I got in the car and we drove all the way down, which would have been an hour and a half ride, except for the fact that we got lost. So probably about 2.5 hours later, we finally find this little house off by itself. We get out of the car, we walk up to the front steps. And I remember as I was walking up to the steps, I was thinking to myself, boy, I'm so grateful that Jim is here because he's Comanche and he's going to know what to say. So we got up to the door, knocked on the door. An old man came to the door with long gray hair in braids. And he opened the door and he looked at us, and I was waiting for Jim to say something. And apparently Jim must have been waiting for me to say something. So the three of us were just kind of standing there staring at each other. So again, I just blurted out the first words that I could think of. And I said, hi, my name is Bob Vetter. I'm a graduate student in anthropology at the University of Oklahoma. And I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about the Comanches. And again, just like the last time, crickets. He stood there staring at me for what seemed like forever. And then finally he spoke and he said, this is how you come to my house? And I didn't know what he was getting at. So I said, yeah. And he said, this is the way you come to my house to see me? And I said, yeah. And he said, come in here for a minute. And he opened the door and he invited us in, and he pointed to the couch that was next to the long wall to the left of the doorway. And he said, sit down over there. Now, he had invited us into his home, but this was really not a very friendly invitation at all. He stormed out of the room, went into a back room. He came back a minute later, and he had a painting in his hand that he held up. And it was a beautiful painting. He was actually a very well-known artist. He was a well-known dancer, powwow dancer on the circuit. But anyway, the painting was of a Comanche war dancer. And I said, wow, that's really beautiful. But He wasn't interested in what I thought of his painting. Here's what he said. He said, see this? And I said, yeah. And he said, I'm an artist and I have better things to do than to sit around talking to you. And another thing, that this is no way to visit an Indian. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, if you're going to visit an Indian, the least thing you could do is bring him something to eat.
Oh.
So now I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say. I just said, I'm really sorry. Jim and I got up off the couch, walked out the door, got to the car, and drove all the way back home, kind of in silence because, we were a little rattled by what had happened. We got near the town that we lived in, Norman, Oklahoma, and I mentioned something about going back. And he said, you're going back to that guy's house? And I said, yeah. And he said, I wouldn't go back to that guy's house if you paid me. And, he had a few other choice things to say about Woodgie. So the next week, I went by myself. Now, I should preface this by telling you that I was a really, really poor graduate student. My financial aid hadn't come in. I had barely enough money to make it to where I was going. I had no money to do anything. So I picked up a pathetic few groceries that I had in a brown paper bag, drove back to his house, walked up to the front door, knocked on the door. Same old man came to the door. He looked at me, he looked at the paper bag in my hand, and he got a big smile on his face. And he said, now that's the way you visit an Indian. He shook my hand and he welcomed me into his home. And he told me a lot about traditional Comanche religion. It turned out that his wife, Eva, was the niece of a famous Comanche medicine woman that a book was written about called Sanapia, Comanche Medicine Woman. Woodgie welcomed me into his home, welcomed me into his life, and made me feel not only at home, but eventually he would come to refer to me as a nephew, that we developed that kind of relationship over time. Now, it turned out that he did know this medicine man that I was told about. And that medicine man's name was Oliver Patapony. Now, every time I went to Woodgie's house, I would ask him, well, you think you could take me over to meet this Oliver Patapony? And he was always like, well, today's not a good day, but maybe the next time you come.
Mm-hmm.
So this happened week after week. And, I had this project coming due at the end of the semester. So one day, out of frustration, I just said, look, I know you're busy. If you tell me how to get to this guy's house, I'll go on my own. And he said, okay. He took a napkin and again drew me a map on a napkin. And then he added to it like these really vague descriptions of, you go to the third ranch, make a right, past the barbed wire fence, go down the dirt road, go over the wooden bridge. These were the kind of directions. And he said, okay. You got that? And I said, yeah, but I really didn't have that. So I was just about to get in the car as the sun was setting. He came running out of his house and he said, you know what? Wait a minute. You'll never find it on your own. I'll tell you what, I'll lead you there and you can follow me. So he got in his car. I got in my car. We drove all the way through these back areas of nowhere. Got to the end of a cul-de-sac on a dirt road. He turned his car around in the opposite direction. He pointed down a driveway and he said, that's it. And he drove away.
Oh.
So here I was in the middle of nowhere, pitch black. I had no gift to give. And I was going to show up at this guy's house unannounced in pitch black darkness. I pulled down this long, long driveway. An outdoor light went on, and I saw like a shaft of light as the door opened, and then it slammed shut. Now, let me also say, this is back in 1980. I'm a New Yorker with all of my New York ideas about my own personal safety and lots of stereotypes about what I thought a native medicine man would look like. Mm-hmm. So now I don't even know if I'm at the right house. And I'm thinking, the door opened and shut because somebody's grabbing a shotgun, going to shoot me, and nobody will ever find me because I'm out in the middle of nowhere. I start walking up to the door with dogs barking and nipping at my ankles as I walk up. I knock on the front door, and this old lady comes to the door. And I said, hi, I'm looking for Oliver Patapony. And she said, uh-huh. And I said, well, does he live here? She said, yeah. And again, we were standing there looking at each other. And finally I said, well, do you think I could talk to him? And she said, well, I guess so. And she opened the door and invited me in. Now, I thought I would meet a medicine man and he'd be sitting in a teepee smoking a ceremonial pipe. That's kind of what I expected. I walked in and he was watching a football game on a color TV. And I thought, well, my stereotypes are exactly wrong. He took time out and he talked to me. And he was very warm and kind to me. And he said, yeah, I'd be willing to talk to you. He said, why don't you come back next week? And then he told me how to get back home and told me to be careful going home in the kindest way possible. So the next week, I met with my advisor, told him what had happened. My advisor said, well, you know, it's good that you met him. Now you're going to have to be very careful about how you negotiate this. Don't talk about medicine because that is a taboo topic. Now, meanwhile, I was thinking to myself, you could have told me that before I met with these other people who gave me, you know, kind of didn't interact with me because I didn't know that. So anyway, I said, well, what do you think I should talk about? He said, well, talk about something innocuous like traditional stories. So I said, okay. So, you know, I did some research, had a yellow pad of paper with some questions on it, and I was ready to ask him all kinds of questions. So I got there and he asked me, you know, well, what would you like to know? And I said, well, I was hoping that maybe we could start out with some traditional Comanche stories. He thought about it for a moment, and this is what he said. So, you know, my wife's sister talks to somebody at the university about things like that. But as far as I'm concerned, that's nothing but a bunch of fairy stories. If you want to hear about real things, things that I observed with my own eyes, that I know from my own experience, I can tell you that kind of story. And that was when he shared the story with me about how he came to his medicine.
Wow.
So I'll pause again, Elizabeth, before I get to the stories that is the heart of our entire interview.
That is a magnanimous story. Oh my goodness. So don't talk about medicine because that's taboo. That would not have been on the forefront of my brain. I would have thought, what's medicine, man? You know, we're going to talk about spirituality. We're going to talk about healing. We're going to talk about everything within the medicine world. My goodness. And the visuals that you give are so absolutely perfect because we can all see you, darkness out in the middle of nowhere. And oh, it's down there. And then they take off. It's like, how many times did you think to yourself, am I doing the right thing? Should I just turn back and go home?
The entire time, every incident, every single thing I did, I asked that question.
Wow.
Now, I should also tell you a little bit about, just for a quick moment, about why this is such a taboo subject.
Okay.
Something that you and your listeners may not know is that medicine is connected to their traditional religion. And traditional Native American religions were against the law in the United States until 1978. It took an act of Congress to restore to them the same religious freedom that was supposedly guaranteed by our government. And that was the reason in the first place for people coming here from Europe to try to escape religious persecution there and come to a new place. But in our country, it was illegal to practice their religions until 1978, and medicine people had actually been thrown in prison. So there are some very good reasons to not want to talk about medicine that I didn't know at that time.
So that would be the absolute reason why when you walked up to the circle of men and you're like, oh, I'm looking for a medicine man. And they're like,
yeah,
oh my gosh. Oh, wow.
Exactly.
Okay. So what was the fear? Like, why did it become illegal?
Well, because we could do an entire episode where we unpack that question and answer. But basically, people came from Europe. They wanted the land. They wanted the resources. The Pope had said before Columbus ever came here, the dictate of the Catholic Church was, the papal bull stated that if you are a European nation and you come as Christians, you have the right to take over any country, any land, any resources, and in the process convert the native people to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And that law, according to scholars of law who tell me, that law still governs on some basic level the way that the United States government still interacts with Native Americans.
Okay. All right. So that brings me up to speed with, I mean,
so
that's a
people
great
wanted,
condense.
They wanted the land. They were willing to take over the resources. They converted Native Americans to Christianity. They put them in boarding schools where they were beaten if they got caught speaking their native language. Everything about their culture was stripped away from them.
Now, I do have a question about that for their own. How do I even develop this question? It's more of their culture and how, you know, of course, they were brutally driven out in certain areas and condensed down and brutalized. And it's such a rough history of the American Indians. You know, the first question that comes to mind is, why aren't they mad as hell? And are they? How do they diffuse that? Because they seem like such an evolved people that stay within spirituality of connection with the earth and surrounding elements. Is that true?
Well, there's not one simple answer to that question. There are lots of people that are the way that you described. There are people who are angry. There are people who are angry at the system, but not necessarily angry at individual people. So, you know, here I am, a white guy showing up in Indian country, not knowing a lot. And, you know, I like to say that the people who I came to be with had a sense of their own spirituality, had a sense of their understanding about themselves, how they're connected to Creator, how they're connected to the earth. All of those things are not happy about the way that they were treated, and yet could separate me from the system that, in a way, you could say that I represent. Does that make sense?
That does totally make sense.
So I don't want to paint a picture of the noble savage, because clearly not everybody is in any way conforming to that stereotype.
Absolutely. And it does not seem so. Not at all. It's just the mind boggles, you know, over the history of just sort of scratching the surface, which I feel like that's all that we really do in our public education is we're mildly scratching the surface there. And it's quite fascinating. So, all right, well, thank you for answering that question. Now, let's go back into the story.
On to the story. So he asked me if I wanted to hear about some real stories, and I said yes. And the story that he started with was the story about how he came to be a medicine man. And I'll share that story with you, because that story then illuminates everything that I'll have to say about healing from that point on. He said, now he sometimes referred to himself as a doctor, as an Indian doctor, but you know, we're using the term medicine man. But he said, what he said was, I didn't set out to be a doctor, but I got sick. I went into the hospital in Lawton, that's the nearest city to him. And he said, you know, the doctors did all kinds of tests and all kinds of treatments for my cancer. And then one day the main doctor came in and he said, you know, the doctors had a series of meetings over your case, and we've decided that there's nothing else that we can do for you. You can stay in the hospital if you'd like, and we can ease your pain, but we've exhausted everything. There's nothing left for us to do for you. And he said, no, his son and his wife were in the hospital that day. And he said, no, he said, I told them, take me out of here. I told my son, take me out there to the hills and leave me there. Now, what he was talking about was something that non-Indians call a vision quest. I honestly have really, I don't think ever heard any Native people use that term, but it's a term that non-Indians are very familiar with. That it's this ceremony, this solo vigil that a person goes on, where they go to a place of known power, where they stay for X number of days and nights with no food, no water, no shelter, no comforts of any kind, no company. And through this encounter, some major change may take place. Some transformative experience might happen if everything is right. So he said, take me out there to the hills and fast. The doctors have given up on me, so I've got nothing to lose. And then his wife said something very interesting to him. She said, you're not man enough to take it. They're going to run you off. And what that means is they had a belief that there are spirits that inhabit these places. And the spirits will test you. And they won't give you what you want until they terrify you. But if you stay in resolve, you may get what it is that you came for. But if you leave in fear, whatever it is that you went there for, you'll never get it as long as you live. So that's what she was getting at. And he said, well, I've got nothing to lose. I might as well go and try. So his son brought him to this place that he had known about as one of these places. And he knew about it because many, many years before him, a friend of his had gone on his vision quest there. Now, that vision quest ceremony was a universal among basically all boys who were about to become a man, and sometimes repeated over the course of a lifetime in the pre-reservation times. But through the reservation period, through the boarding school period that I mentioned, through the loss of culture, it had just about disappeared. He knew about that place, and he had his son bring him there. He got there and had nothing with him other than a sheet to cover himself up with. He had an eagle feather, which is this very, very powerful symbol for many Native Americans, but particularly for the Plains people. He had 4 corn husks, which are the outer wrapping on the corn that they use for rolling prayer cigarettes and tobacco. We went to that spot, sat up, nothing happened all night, but he said that he was terrified through the night. And he smoked the 4 prayer smokes through the night. Then he said, a little bit before sunrise, he said, I could hear a rustling of leaves over toward Mount Scott. That's the mountain opposite him. And after a while, I could see something off in the distance, and it looked like a flame that would flicker. It would glow on, and then it would go off, and then it would go on, and it would go off. And as it kept coming closer to me, I could make out an outline of what looked like a human form. And he said, as it got even closer, I realized that what the light was that every time it exhaled, that fire shot out of its mouth. And he referred to this being as the visitor. So he said as the visitor got closer, I realized that he was coming for me. And I got more and more and more scared. And he said, I was a pathetic man. I was like, if you take a fish and pull it out on the dry land and let it flop around helpless. He said, I was that way.
Oh my God.
And then he said, finally, it got right up in front of me. And he said, he shot me with that fire. And when that fire hit me, he said, everything stopped. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My heart stopped. Everything stopped. Until finally, he said, the visitor spoke to me. And it spoke to me in my native Comanche language. He said, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm sick. The visitor said, there's nothing the matter with you. You're going to be all right. But they sent me to take care of somebody who's real bad off. And with that, the visitor began to take off to the west. But he turned around one last time and he looked at my grandpa Chief, and he said, son, he said, did you know that this whole world stops for just a very little while, for a moment, right before the sun comes up? That's the time when things like me can enter into this world. And then with that, the visitor took off to the west, and he never saw him again. Well, his son came to get him sometime later in the day. And when his son saw him, he said, Dad, he said, are you all right? And Oliver, Chief had a pony. He said, yeah. He said, I'm fine. And he said, his son said, well, it was so cold everywhere else. He said, how did you make it through the night? And he said, well, where I was at, it was like springtime. And when they got down off that rise, there was a hard frost on the ground everywhere except for where he had been seated through the night. But he never had the cancer again.
Wow.
And something changed in him in a big way. So he said he was walking down the street. He lived in a little tiny town, outside of a little tiny town called Apache, Oklahoma, that looked like something out of a Western movie. So he was walking down the street in this little town, and an old Comanche woman who had been a medicine woman walked up to him, and she said, what happened to you? And he said, well, what do you mean? And she said, something's different about you. What happened? And he didn't want to talk about it. So she pushed him and she said, I know there's something different about you. I can tell from looking at you. And he told her the whole story that I just told you. And when he got done, she nodded her head and she said, you know, you're good for something. You might not know what it is right now, but you're going to find out soon exactly what that is. And he thought about that. And he thought about what he had remembered as a boy. Now, we don't really know when he was born exactly because they didn't really keep birth records during that time. But I met him in 1980, and he was probably 90 years old then. So you figure he was born in the late 1800s, and he was talking about the medicine men that were old men when he was a little boy. And he started thinking about the ways that he had seen them doctor people who were sick. And somehow a formula came to him about how to heal other people. And he became what's known as a coal doctor. So he would build a fire and he would reach in with his fingers and pull out a glowing red hot coal and put it in his mouth. And that would activate the power that he had to doctor somebody who was sick. And the way that he explained it to me was in saying that sickness is like a fire, and you've got to fight fire with fire. He said the person's flesh, when it's in my hands, is like when you pour cement and you can move it around, but when it dries, it stays the way that it is. He said, when I have that coal in my mouth, it has to be a live coal, but the person's flesh becomes like that wet cement in my hands that I can move back to the way that it's supposed to be. Well, eventually, people started to hear about this transformative vision that he had. And eventually people started to show up at his home because they believed that he had this healing power. And he began his life as a medicine man. Now, eventually he came to adopt me as a grandson. And that's how I came to be a part of his family. But now let's take that story, and now that there's a whole, I could spend all day telling you stories like this.
Sure.
But the point that I want to make about the healing aspect of the story is that what healed him became his method of doctoring other people. In other words, if I had to come up with a formula from this, it would be to tell you that out of our own individual suffering, there is an antidote that not only works for us, but for anybody that we seek to help in the future.
Wow.
And that's maybe the core message that I want to stop with at this point and kind of take a break.
Absolutely. I love that. So out of our own individual suffering is the answer. What was that quote again? Is the answer?
is that, well, the antidote is contained within our suffering, that if we move beyond it, if we heal ourselves of it, that it also provides us with some mechanism to help other people in their suffering.
Got it. Got it. I'm glad that I asked because I really wanted to hear that again. That was so magical. It was so powerful. There's so much within that statement that really kind of brings it full circle to realize that things don't happen to us. It's there for a purpose. And that in society of today really seems to be the key that is lost. And, we kind of, what are we walking around like cyborgs and we think that things are just bouncing, it's just happening. Oh, that's just happening to us. No, no, no. There's such a deeper spiritual connection there of why things seem to be the way they are. Now, with that said,
Exactly.
I love that quote. Thank you so much for reiterating that quote. I do have a couple of questions, especially, I do want to take a moment to talk about your podcast, but I also do want to get back to the story. The story is mesmerizing. Like, we could just I'll just let it roll. We can sit here for a couple hours and just listen because this is the quietest I've ever been because it's so absolutely amazing and engaging. All right. So
if I can pick up from there and tell you the other thread, because there's one main line that takes us through Native North American medicine. And as you said in my bio, eventually, many, many years later, I would meet Richie Tarza, who was a medicine man in the Kiowa tribe, who would adopt me as a nephew and ask me if I would record the story of his family, of his great-great-grandfather, Big Bo, and of the medicine practices that Big Bo did and that Uncle Richie did. So all of that is kind of one parallel part of the story. But then there's this other parallel part that I'd like to tell you about quickly, which has to do with Curanderismo.
Okay, yes.
So I was studying, I was taking courses in anthropology as a graduate student. I had this and many other experiences with Oliver Pataponi, who came to be my Comanche grandpa. At the same time, I also had an interest that was in healing and spirituality in general, and I wanted to find out about it in other cultural contexts as well. I was taking a course with a professor who taught a course on ancient Mesoamerica. And mostly, it was talking about things thousands of years ago. This professor had done his field work in Oaxaca, a state in southern Mexico. A lot of it had to do with the Mexica or Aztecs, with the Maya, with these ancient cultures. But he mentioned one day in passing, it was just an aside, he said that there is a cultural practice today called Curanderismo. And it has its roots in ancient Mexico, but it's a healthcare system that is still in use today, particularly in rural areas of Mexico. And all of a sudden, my ears perked up, and I, really listened. And he gave me an idea of where I could look at research on it. He said Oaxaca, where he had done his field work, is a place where it's still very much in practice. So I did an independent study project on Curanderismo, and I learned that it is practiced, this is at that time in 1980, on both sides of the Mexican border. So all over rural Mexico, but also in places like San Antonio, Texas, and throughout that southern border area of Texas. So I kind of made a plan that I would do 2 studies of Curanderismo, one in San Antonio, Texas, because I could drive there back and forth from Norman, Oklahoma. And then eventually I would go and spend 1 year doing a field residency in Oaxaca with medicine people there, with curanderos, or the practitioners of this medicine. For a variety of reasons, I ended up taking a terminal master's degree and kind of abandoning the entire thing and moved back to New York. I began kind of a whole different trajectory of my life. But eventually, I joined something called, it was a chapter of a movement called the Native American Church. And this is a it has become a religion that started in the 1800s among the Plains tribes and then eventually spread out to other tribes. And I joined and I said, I can't come here on a regular basis, but if there's something that you could recommend, a ceremony that you want me to go to every year, I'll do my best to attend that. And the answer that I was given was, we go down once a year to do our annual gathering of the medicine that we bring back to Oklahoma. So I agreed to go on that. And I flew to San Antonio, Texas, in order to be able to drive to where this ceremony takes place. And while I was there, all of a sudden I got to thinking, wow, this is where I was going to do that field work. I wonder if there's anyone still practicing Curanderismo.
Mm-hmm.
And I did research this, research that. I couldn't find any references to anybody still doing it. And it was the day before I was going to leave. And somehow I found this obscure article about an anthropologist who had given a talk at a local library with a curandera who lived in San Antonio and worked at a particular store in town. So the day before I was going to leave, I walked into the store and she was there. Her name was La Golondrina, is what she referred to herself as. And I met her and spent the entire day in the store with her, and she became my first teacher in Curanderismo. After her, I went through a series of apprenticeships with different practitioners here in the United States, and eventually would come to meet a man who became a mentor, a friend, a brother, Laurencio Lopez Nunez, who is from Oaxaca. And I ended up going to Oaxaca to study the way of the Temazcal and other aspects of these healing practices.
Mm-hmm.
So all of this kind of comes together through this metaphor of understanding Oliver, my grandpa Chief's story, then working in Curanderismo, being taught the very specific things that go along with that medicine, and then a bunch of other healing modalities from all over the world in coming to create the way that I work today.
All right. So, wow. Okay. But there's still a missing piece. You're still traveling to Mexico to the ceremony to get the medicine to bring back to San Antonio. Correct?
Okay. So, right. So the point of that story is, actually, the point of this whole story is that I had one idea of what my life was going to be like, and that somehow it took a completely different trajectory, seemingly through events that were out of my own control.
Mm.
Every step along the way, what happened seemed at times like something awful that turned out to be this incredible gift. And so, if I really want to own this story, the point is, I came from, in many ways, I guess you could describe a very broken childhood with my own traumas, my own lack of connection within a family environment. In the whole Native American side of this, I was blessed in being welcomed into one family after another in a number of tribes who took me in and made me a family member. And through this love, through their spirituality, through their connection that goes below to the earth, above to the sky, and within the social context where all of this is practiced, I came to understand spirituality as embedded in social relations. I went to Texas seemingly because I wanted to be a part of that ceremony, only to find all of those other intentions that I had set. The intention of studying Curanderismo in Texas and in Oaxaca, all of a sudden this whole mechanism gets kicked into place and my life goes off in that direction. So the point is that somehow I got to discover this medicine in a way that I could have never expected or intended.
It's amazing. I mean, so far, and I know the story doesn't even feel completely finished, and there's so many more stories. And it's rich. It's just so rich. And you have a video on your website on bobvetter.com. That's BOBVETTER.com. I feel like this is a good time to show that video.
I would love if you do that. That'd be great.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to bring
the animation tell the story.
All right. Absolutely.
You were born into a body with almost boundless energy, intellectual gifts, and innate abilities. You came to know a confusing world. You experienced a moment of spiritual fright. In the process, you lost a part of yourself and a little bit of your vitality. You developed an interest in spiritual thought and practice. You endured other moments of spiritual fright. With each one, a little more of your vital energy left you. You connected with a healing or other spiritual practice in order to help other people. Hint, you were really trying to heal yourself. You worked at developing your skills and honing your new craft. You felt an inner rumbling, suggesting that something in yourself needs healing. This is where you may find yourself right now. You uncover your old wounds and restore the parts of your being that left long ago. In the process, retrieving the vital energy you had lost earlier. You connect your own healing process to how you work with your clients. It changes your way of being with them and maybe even the profile of who comes to seek your help. Your renewed personal vitality extends to your practice, changing everything about how you facilitate healing for others. You give to others some of what you have received in your own healing by connecting through community. You were born into a body with almost boundless energy.
Wow. I absolutely love that, Bob. Let me turn my volume down just a little bit so I don't have any echo here. Oh my goodness. That's really powerful. How long?
It is powerful, and the reason that it's so powerful is that I think it strikes a chord in everyone because we all get it on some visceral level.
Yeah.
And if it's okay, I want to take just a quick moment to explain something called Susto, because that is at the basis of understanding that video clip, that animation. In Curanderismo, there is the belief that we as human beings can suffer from a condition called Susto, Susto. And throughout Latin America, this is considered an actual illness. It is not recognized as an illness in our world, but it refers to something called, the translation is sometimes magical fright, but I think a better way to understand it is soul fright. That there are events that happen in our life that are so overwhelming that a part of us is left behind at that place and time. And it's a strategy. It's a mechanism that's built into us as human beings to help us to go on when something's so difficult, so challenging that we don't know how to go on. So a splinter of the soul gets left behind at that time and that place. Now that works as a short-term strategy because it helps me to continue in my life. But a little bit of my life force gets left behind at that time and that place. It also sets me up for another Susto because probably something else is going to happen that activates that same mechanism again. And then I get a second Susto, and a little bit more of my vital energy is left in that place and that time. And over the course of life, most of us experience a series of Sustos that are connected in one way or another. And I wonder then, later on in my life, why I've lost my passion to live, why it seems like I'm stuck in my life, why things aren't going the way that they should go, the way that I expected them to go, why patterns repeat over and over again, why I suffer in a way that seems to make no sense. So through these through these healing ceremonies, we bring back the parts of the soul that have left us. And that's what the animation is about, is finding those pieces and bringing them back to our lives.
That sounds like something that would take a very, very long time to do, to find all those splinters, all of those crumbs, as you say. We walk through life and we're just dropping crumbs everywhere. Um, Take us through your clients and people that become engaged with you. What does their journey look like? How, so many people say, oh, I offer so many sessions, I this, that, and the other. This is so much deeper. It seems like it's really a relationship, so much so as the connection that you made with your friends, your relatives, of the medicine man and all of his friends and the families and everybody who took you in. That's a family, that's a connection. So how can someone become a client of yours? And what does that look like?
Well, since COVID, I began working on Zoom, and at first I thought, well, this is complex ceremonialism that goes along with this. This couldn't possibly work over Zoom. And what I found out is that it can. That most of my clients are some ways away from me. As I said, I live in New York, and I would say most of them are on Zoom. I was just on right prior to this with a client who lives in Hawaii, so they're calling it on Zoom from all over, and the interaction with me ranges anywhere from, sometimes I've had a single session or a series of like 4 sessions. I have a person who's been with me for over a year now, meeting once a week, and her life has turned around in ways that she would never have imagined before. That we have worked through the various sustos, literally cleaned up every single part of a lifetime of trauma.
Wow.
And, she has been incredibly brave in the process, and it's us working together. And, I don't think of myself as anything other than a curious person who's willing to go along with her in order to find out where it will lead. If anything, I seek to be a conduit for that healing power that exists out there in the world. And it's amazing what can possibly be done.
What have you found? It seems like there's going to be so much return in energy of being able to help people clean up the cystos and clean up their lost pieces, to gather them and put it all back together, and the understanding and the enlightenment and just that road. What does it feel like to work hand in hand with someone and see their progress?
Well, it is at times painful,
Mm.
and at times it is the most beautiful experience that you can imagine. Now, it's painful in the sense that there are times where I need to be with someone in their suffering.
Mhm.
And the biggest challenge is, when I go with that person on their personal journey, I hear of things that are just heartbreaking, and it's sometimes difficult. And to sit with a person in their suffering is, first of all, it's the first step of medicine. Because what most people will do when they're told about trauma is they will try to fix it, or they'll try to get the person to look on the positive side. Whereas chances are that what that person needs is for someone to bear witness to it, to hold sacred space for it, so that that wound can be expressed.
Mm-hmm.
That happens before any of the ceremony, any of the work in changing it. First, we have to be with what is. And that part can be very, very honestly difficult at times. And I feel like I experience their suffering with them in that moment. And then the flip side of that is that when it does change over time, to see someone to go from having no desire to continue living in some cases to a fully energized life of seeing purpose and meaning that derives from their initial suffering and leads to the way that they can be in the world to be of service to other people.
That's just such a beautiful thing that we're able to do as spirits in the human body. It's amazing, isn't it?
Can I tell you about something that this led me to that's kind of curious, and it leads me to something that I want to offer to your listeners, your viewers, I should say.
Sure.
So, I was trying to make sense of this. I was trying to make sense out of, why are we born into a life like this? Why do we go from, whatever your spiritual and religious beliefs are, even if you don't have any, we go from non-being to being to non-being. That's somehow we get thrown into this world. And it makes me think of this saying, and I wish I knew which existential philosopher said this. I don't know who it's attributed to, but it's such a great way to understand life. This is what they said. Our existential dilemma is that as human beings, it's like we are walking into the second act of a play, trying to figure out what's going on when we have absolutely no idea what happened in the first act of the play. And what I mean by that is, when we just experience all of these sufferings, you ask the question, well, why? Why is there suffering? Why me? That's a question that you ask that you don't always get an answer to it. So it may not be the most important question. The more important question is, out of this suffering, what do I do? What do I do, and how do I help others eventually? So anyway, I was thinking about all of this, and I was thinking of the levels, what happens at various stages in life. Because in a lot of indigenous traditions, we talk about 4 stages of life that we go through, and each one has its unique lessons to teach. And then I was thinking about, well, how do I communicate that? And I got to thinking about the game Chutes and Ladders. You ever play Chutes and Ladders?
I have.
Well, you know the origin of Chutes and Ladders?
No, I don't.
Well, this is pretty interesting. I found out that Chutes and Ladders didn't start out as a children's game. It started out as a game that was designed for Hindu monks to understand the levels of spiritual development.
What?
Now, in the game, yeah, that's why Chutes and Ladders. The game was originally called Leela. It comes from India, and it was designed for Hindu monks to understand the process of spiritual unfoldment.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought to myself, that's fascinating. That's what happens with sustos. Because when you have a susto, there are actually 2 choices. One choice is to learn from the susto, in which case it's like a ladder that brings you up to a higher level of spiritual attainment. But at the same time, if you fail to learn the lesson of susto, through your trauma, you are going to create a series of problems, maybe for yourself, maybe from people around you. So it's like dropping down several levels of spiritual development. So I put together this game that I call Sustos, and it's loaded onto my website, and anybody who wants to can go to my website. They can download the game itself, and all you need is a die, like from a set of dice, and you can play the game. So you can either play it by yourself and look at the different experiences. It's going to ask you questions about what happened in your life, or you can play it with a group of people who are willing to get to know each other on this deeper psycho-spiritual level. where you're making your way on the board all the way up to the top. But the ladders either shoot you down or shoot you up, depending on what happens in your individual Susto experiences. So anyway, it's a lot of fun, and it's available for free for anybody who wants to download it.
Where do we find it on your website? I've got the website pulled up right now.
So if you look, I think it's up towards the top center. There's something that says Sustos, I think, or download the Sustos game.
On the homepage?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Very interesting.
It's a free download for anybody who wants to. You can print it out and then use it to play the game.
That is so inventive. I really. Oh, you know what? Okay. So I'm scrolling through and I found your podcast. I would love to chat about your podcast for a minute, if you don't mind. Healing
Absolutely.
and spirituality in world cultures. Tell me a little bit about that. Wow, you have some very powerful topics.
Yeah, so I mentioned from the beginning that my area of interest is the intersection of spirituality and healing. And, I'm interested in indigenous ways that those two that they come together in traditional cultures. So my podcast is an attempt to share that experience with others. So at times it's me talking about my experiences, just like I have with you today. And a lot of the episodes, there's, I think, about 126 that are up there so far, something like that. And many of them are interviews with people who are practitioners of various different healing arts, non-Western and Western. So in these interviews, typically the format is that we talk about that person's own spiritual journey. And we haven't used the term yet, but the wounded healer archetype that Carl Jung, this incredible figure in psychology, he was the one who really popularized this idea of the wounded healer, that a person who is a healer goes into it as a result of needing healing themselves and eventually wanting to share that with other people. So we talk about that practitioner's own wounded healer experience. We talk about the training that they've had with other people who are masters in various healing arts. We talk about things that are relevant to the modern world as well. In other words, how do we take something from these indigenous ways and make it relevant and meaningful to our experience? Mm-hmm. And we all, regardless of our culture, have certain things in common in terms of our sufferings, in terms of trying to make meaning out of life in a difficult world.
And that absolutely sums it up. Life in a difficult world, doesn't it? Just as you had said before, and I wrote down the quote here, where it's like you're walking into the second act of a play and we have no idea what's going on and who we are and who goes where and who goes, but we're supposed to play in the play. That almost...
Not only that, but there are my own individual sustos, but there's also collective susto. Mm-hmm. So if you look at COVID, susto is rampant. Even if you didn't do anything else, you have susto because of COVID. And now we have the war in Ukraine with horrific images that we look at on television and in other sources. So we're bombarded by sustos in the collective field that we are a part of.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I absolutely agree. I was talking to a guest earlier. We were talking about positivity, the positivity in the media that's so needed, because it seems like, and she was an actress in the entertainment field. So we were talking about, the sensationalism of the negative entertainment media of, oh, this one's going through a horrible divorce. This one, did this one did that. And it's so interesting that, the brain is always mobile, it seems. It was all positive. If we could focus on positive, it looks like Bob may have fallen off of the call for a minute, so give me just one moment. We see picture in picture too, Elizabeth. Let me go ahead and FaceTime Bob one more time, and we'll have him back into the show. It's really quite an interesting time with Mr. Bob Vetter, and his website is bobvetter.com. We are talking about spiritual healing. Here you are. We're right back. Yeah, so I was talking about the last guest that I had on and how she's in entertainment. I was saying, it's so really needed in society that we have positive news. And, if we could only have started off with positive news and that was sensationalized, can you imagine what our minds would be? Can you imagine what our souls would be right now?
Exactly. We're feeding on junk food, aren't we?
Yes, we are. Yes, we really are. Well, I find what you do to be absolutely mesmerizing. You have fed me so much information. I had no idea what I was in store for. And you have so many wonderful stories. I'd love to have you back on the show and we can dive even deeper into more things. But of course, before we depart, you do have a workshop coming up. And I would love to talk about your workshop for a moment.
Yeah, so I'm giving this workshop with a dear friend of mine, Louis Mel Madrona, who is he's an MD doctor, he's a psychiatrist, he's the author of many, many books on traditional healing because he is part Lakota and part Cherokee. And so he has a foot in two worlds. He practices and really teaches something called two-eyed seeing, which is how we apply the ideas of healing both from indigenous and from Western perspectives. He's got books on coyote healing, narrative healing, a whole bunch of different areas. And both he and I have a tremendous number of Native American stories that are in our repertoire. And the title of the workshop is A Long, Long Time Ago, because that's how, no, wait a minute. No, back when all beings spoke the same language, because that's the way a lot of these stories begin. Mm-hmm. But they go back to a time when animals, human beings, everybody spoke the same language. So we're using traditional stories in the healing process. It's a 2-day workshop. For those people who are coming in person, it'll take place in Maine, where he lives, but it's also being offered simultaneously on Zoom. So information on that is available on my website under events. So that'll be on April 23rd and 24th.
That's wonderful. So while you were speaking, I had the website live so that we could all see it. And everybody, goes to bobvetter.com. That's BOBVETTER.com and hit events from the toolbar. And it will take you to when all beings spoke the same language using stories from healing and soul growth. And congratulations on that event. Congratulations on everything that you're doing. It's such a magical place for you to be at, and I use magical as the only word that's really coming to mind because it's just mind, body, and spirit, and everything collectively has put you into this moment. And I'm just so thankful that you're there. I can feel within your story the passion and the pain and everything that you've had to collect and bring yourself to whole. And I thank you 100 times over for spending time with me on our show.
Oh, Elizabeth, it's such a pleasure to be here with you and to meet your viewers. Thank you so much for spending part of the afternoon with me.
Absolutely. And you are a friend of the show. You're a friend of mine. So if you ever have anything else that you would like me to advertise for you or come back onto the show and we can talk about, you're more than welcome.
I'd love to come back on your show sometime. Thank you.
That's wonderful. All right, Bob, have a great weekend. We'll see you again soon.
Thanks, you too, Elizabeth.
All right, thank you. Oh my goodness, everybody. So we are blessed. You are blessed. Mwah! I love you, and I will see you up next with another great show. Take care, everybody. Bye now.